another analogy in my life, it will be too soon.
Oh, well, that's all he knows how to do. But I discovered that he's not read much baraminology work because he doesn't know the terminology, that he repeatedly, of course, doesn't know about most of the fossil record, most of the biological data, because anybody who did would be using examples of it. So the two issues I'm just itching
But
to explore
bluefish,
with him.
RJ. Redfish, bluefish.
Yeah, bluefish. What about purple fish? When you understand how that systematics doesn't occur in their head, his position is extremely understandable. Nothing about what he said surprised me in the least, because he's coming from that frame where they have don't connect the dots, don't really know the dots are there, presuppositional, you can't show. He's always going to focus in on the microevolution, and by definition, no individual microevolution event is going to produce the big change.
Right. Even when we tried to, and literally every time we tried to bring up specific examples, he's like, that's not the point. It's like,
yeah.
At some point, it has to be the point. We can't.
Yeah, and this is
why do we have these metaphors?
This is why I will hope eventually to be able to do the speciation book, because this is a core 100% failure rate among all anti-evolutionists. Intelligent designers suffer from it just as bad.
Yeah. Why do you need to bring up an analogy in every situation when scientists have no problem using no analogy when communicating with each other?
Right. He said that he wasn't prepared for a talk with actual data. The other one. And so it's like you came to talk about biology, but you had no biology to talk about.
Because he doesn't have any. That's why I'm the one area that was weakest for exploration was his source base, although he did reveal some. Kirby and Jackson, really?
and he didn't know the difference between a quote mine and a legit quote.
Yeah, that's another thing that you find in the bottom feeder level. And although he's a charming, pleasant, affable bottom feeder, he is a bottom feeder. I doubt he has ever bothered to read any of the higher level material. If he's trawling around at Charles Jackson level, who's kind of a video redactor, he's way removed even from their own higher level creationist literature.
He's not reading Todd Wood or Kavanaugh or anything like that.
Yeah. Let alone source check any of them. Like Kirby goes out of his way to bring up sources.
Todd Wood is my favorite creationist because he is very honest about his.
Yeah. He's a bright guy. I feel sorry for him, and I'm wondering whether, as years go by, if there won't be some horrifying epiphany moment where he suddenly goes, "Oh hell, I can't go through it anymore. I gotta say evolution is true." I don't know. It might someday happen because he knows the data really well.
He has explicitly stated that he is aware that there is overwhelming evidence for evolution, but he just chooses not to believe it.
Yeah, and you get some of the same mindset occurs with Hugh Ross over in the Old Earth creationist side. One of the most revealing things he ever said was that when I think he was debating Dwayne Gish or somebody like that, and his position was that if he Ross believed the Bible taught that the Earth was young, he would disbelieve all of his own astronomy evidence a priori. But because he doesn't believe the Bible teaches that, he's okay with it. So his mindset functionally is no different than Dwayne Gish.
Yeah.
Yeah, this conversation though had no data. All data is irrelevant.
No. And I loved his blackboard example, because every example he uses reduces everything to the most basic cartoon level. And
rain on the rocks, RJ. Rain on the rocks.
Rain on the rocks. And his object, he admits it, his object is to make things sound good to the hoi polloi out in his audience base. And the idea that he's going to be able to talk at a technical level, I am not holding my breath on that one.
No, when you watch his video, and that's something we talked about, RJ, when we discussed his videos, and also Matt Powell and Kent Hovind and all that. He does not rely on any sources when he writes his videos. Like when you look at my descriptions, you can see these are the papers I'm drawing from. I'm looking at this one and this one and this one. But with his videos, he doesn't have that. There's no there's no delineation of whatever sources he's drawing on, whether they're
He's a
creationist or
bottom
not.
feeder.
There's just nothing.
Methodologically, he's in the same boat as the people he's running around, Kent Hovind and all that, because I will wager that Jackson, and I already know from Kirby once in a while comes up with his own little twists, but they're all riffing off of secondary source material. And so in that respect, you've got a superficial secondary people being riffed on by the bottom feeder. Kent Hovind is another bottom feeder. So they're going to operate in the same way. They want to drag everything onto a presuppositional base where you have to only deal with their thing. And unless you can show that a redfish can turn into a lizard in one fell swoop, he's got the argument.
There's another thing that happened in the off-air section after the Hangout, because I asked him why he would not use pictures like this instead of spending so much time in making these cartoonishly perverted versions of evolutionary diagrams. And he simply said that he wants to simplify this, but what is simplifying about adding a can of soup into a evolutionary diagram?
I love that chart you have, because notice what's at the bottom, where my little brain immediately jumps out. The genes that they're identifying and the specific duplications that are involved that act as that substrate. That's the kind of stuff, that's the data floor. And if he comes onto my show at some stage, and I'm not holding my breath on that, that I'll be wanting to explore what he reads. We know he seems to have no problem with reading a quote from somebody from some other source, and now he thinks he understands that person. That's the essence of quote miner.
My heart died a little bit when he said Charles Darwin was a terrible writer.
Yeah, he's very 19th century. I'll give him that. If you have to understand he's writing in that style, but oh my God, is he careful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's well, and that wasn't even Orange or Brian makes a lot of little pronouncements about Charles Darwin, and they are almost entirely completely backwards. Yeah. He did a recent video where he said Darwin and Lyell were basically creating their theories to fight God.
Yeah, exactly the opposite for Lyell, because Lyell was religious
his whole life.
Yeah, he could never quite buy into human evolution, precisely because he was balking at that human origins things, and he was still pretty pesky about it.
And
by the way, I put a link of the paper for this picture in the live chat for those who are interested.
Okay.
Yeah, I probably have it in my bibliography. I did put that wonderful summary piece that you posted on the tetrapod limb. I put that in the live chat so people could bring to that, because that's a very nice summary piece and has good graphics.
But in his examples, in Orange's examples, yeah, he always seems to have like what happened historically completely backwards. It wasn't that they made these ideas to fight God. Darwin was a Christian. Until long past the point he wrote Origin of Species. Lyell was a Christian his whole life. It's like, to his mind, if these people are disagreeing with the Bible, it's because they are atheists or whatever.
Yeah, and we have many religious people, religious scientists advocating for evolution, like Kenneth Miller.
Mary Schweitzer and all the others.
And in the 19th century, what's so striking is how few religious people were really digging in their heels against evolution. That it was way less controversial than you might have imagined. It did split along the culture camp lines, though, that more politically conservative religionists were less likely to be cheery about evolution. Ones that we would now classify on the more liberal spectrum were more open with it. But that's that whole accommodationism thing. They'd already gone through this on two big issues. One was the age of the Earth, because that was kicking in the late 18th and early 19th century and was already in the place by the time Sedgwick, who remained a creationist down to his dying day, but he accepted that the flood didn't happen and that the Earth was extremely old and so forth and so on. And then you've got the that moral, ethical Bible analysis problem that was coming up from higher criticism that was really kicking into high gear in the 1860s and 70s.
Yeah. And another thing I was trying to show him during the Hangout was this paper. It's about when they removed a gene from a bacteria, and later it duplicated another gene, and the duplicated version replaced the old gene's function. So you have an increase you have an increase in information, basically.
That's why the details matter. The whole point is that to go from fish to a lizard doesn't involve a single step, but it also involves a series of very slow incremental mutation changes, which are being identified directly in the technical literature. And I am reasonably confident that Brian has not got within 100 miles of reading a science paper on tetrapod genetics.
Yeah. And when he showed the diagram of the fish turning into a lizard, I can only think of the dozens of videos that RRR has made showing the transition from just fish to something that is beginning to look like a reptile.
Yeah, and there's been very little baraminology work yet on that tetrapod side, just a smattering, in the same way that they've avoided the reptile mammal transition part, because oh boy, that's a can of worms for them. So they were starting out with basically plant families, Wood and Kavanaugh. That was the kind of stuff they did with. They're starting to tiptoe into it because they have to. They're forced by the flood geology model to account for how many created kinds there were. So there's an imperative there, and they're never going to make it fit.
Yeah, and he went completely bonkers when you mentioned Tiktaalik. He went into a rant mode, basically.
Well, he repeated apologetics.
Yeah.
Which and this that little bit he gave. Well, there's a fossil. There are footprints that are millions of years earlier. That's a trope that pops up in intelligent design literature too. Casey Luskin and others would have been bringing that up. So it's not even restricted to the young Earth creationists. They have their own map of time problems with a different context.
and even it is a legit tetrapod fossil footprint. It doesn't disprove. That doesn't make Tiktaalik not a transition fossil, because we also have wolves living alongside dogs today. So
yeah, this is like saying that your grandfather can't be your grandfather anymore because you've just found your great grandfather.
No, it's more like you can't have cousins anymore because somehow cousins need to go extinct somehow.
Yeah, I call it the no cousins rule in my TIP project to relate to what Gish is saying. You know, they don't allow cousins. The problem is monobaramins are cousins. And that's the Achilles heel of all of their systematics, because once you start allowing for things that really don't look quite the same and that common people would regard as different kinds are in fact within the same kind, ooh, that's a slippery slope. But they've got to do that in order to minimize the number of kinds. And as I pointed out already in a couple of the evolution hours, and I'll want to bring up with Brian, is there are two fatal bottlenecks in their argument, because they have to have a repertoire of fixed created kinds. That's the initial thing, which is happening 4000 BC thereabouts. Then there's the first bottleneck, which is the fossil distribution, where virtually all of that has to have been alive at the time of the flood, therefore had to have differentiated from the created kinds all within 1700 years or less. Then there's the second bottleneck, where those same created kinds aboard the Ark then go wandering off of Ararat, and in a roughly, again, about 1700 years or less, proliferated into all the species we see today. Two bottlenecks. And boy, they're facing a problem with either one of them. Blue.
Red fish.
Wait, I'm going to show him.
Unmute, Blue, and show yourself.
No, it's me. I have a cameraman on, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't put my camera on here because I'm still in my jammies. This is really early for me. I would just now be getting up, and I still haven't shaved and all the other little things, and I did get my cereal out of the way. Oh, by the way, Jackson, I'll give you a heads up there. I'm now coordinating my main point about good old Riddle and his radiometric chapter. His smoking guns are 2 in number, both of them from Austin Snelling. And so what I'm doing is now I've worked out what the core of the problem is. That Snelling and Austin's position is that they can arrange all of these stupid little dates contradictory ways that they conflict with different modes. They have to be presuming that they're all from exactly the same rock deposits, not from other places in the Beartooth range, because it's a mountain range. It's forming over a long period of time. And that the different methods are truly in conflict when you take into account all the dynamics, for example, argon leaking out of the potassium argon thing. And then the elephant in the room that none of them want to deal with is, can they really explain this by a young Earth creationist flood model? And I know they aren't going to do the third part, but it's that shell game that I'm going to be looking through, because I've been able to track down most of their primary sources. So I'm going to be diving through there to figure out just exactly, are they doing a 3-card Monty and where it is. If I'm successful in this, it means I will have vaporized the 2 heavy guns that Riddle brings up, and therefore his entire radiometric argument falls apart.
Intriguing. I am still finishing up with Bodhi's. School's been slowing me down a bit. I'm still working on Bodhi's.
Understandable. It's the same thing
mutations.
with me. See, but oh gosh, it's fun, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I'm working on his. He has the same song and dance for all the different types of mutations, where he has wait for it, a metaphor, and he uses that metaphor and shows why it's a bad. He shows why nothing good comes of it, and then says, here's an example of a real life bad mutation that occurs. And then I have to go, okay, here's an example of a positive thing this mutation has caused also. And so he just does that.
I'll do as well. We'll be putting a vice, because I'll, if you haven't already done so, I'll follow up on the bad mutation, because that's a theodicy issue. And if he's trying to argue that that's a natural mutation or just sin debt, or where exactly is it trying to come down on that little fun and games, and the structural genes that are involved in that bad mutation, anything that can be deduced as an unintended side effect from the very structure of the gene is a terrible theodicy problem for them.
The structural genes don't matter, RJ. Don't you know?
Oh, yes. Well, of course not. Yeah, especially if you reduce it to a cartoon.
Yeah.
There are fish and there are lizards, and there is no in between.
Well, my super monobaramin is way easier. There are cows and non-cows.
One of the things that I was itching trying to say, but of course I want to held myself back because I want to let Jackson talk as much as possible. But when you try to classify things as fish and lizards, you must actually put lizards among fish, specifically the lobe-finned fish.
Oh yeah,
well, we tried bringing up that issue 2 or 3 times, and he never looked at it. He said it's irrelevant every time we tried to mention it.
Data is irrelevant because that's the map of time issue again. Literally, there are no spots. There are no placeholders in here. Oh, I can't stand not using my hands on here, so you're going to have the shock of seeing me in the flesh.
In your gym jams?
There we go. See, I'm in my jammies and all that kind of stuff.
RJ's in the gym jams.
There's his literal hierarchy of structure. He doesn't allow to ever happen. He's got this vague notion of things that existed, but there's no spots in his brain where individual organisms are planted and then filtered into the placeholder category of what evolutionists say they are versus his creationist placeholder as to what he thinks they are. He doesn't get to that stage. It's all just squishy generic.
Yeah, well, I mean, because there are no actual data points. This is all just metaphor. So how could we ever possibly have anything that isn't entirely generic?
Yeah. It's all metaphorical. Like these fossils.
I don't know if he's ever thing.
I don't know if he's ever going to actually look at like non-metaphorical data.
Blue, I have my cameraman on, so it's safe for random guys to join.
Oh, okay. Good looking out. Yeah. Good looking out. Thank you, Ness.
Yeah. And he warned me to remove the link from the live tip, but I have cameraman on, so if a porn bomber shows up, he is hidden or she is hidden from the.
It's fair to say that all the bottom feeders have no clue how diverse existing and fossil life are, because they don't
irrelevant.
read anything on it. They're drawing off of secondary resources. I mean, he thinks that Jackson and Kirby are his source base, and so he reads some little quote snips, and literally that's all he needs to fill out his brain, and then he moves away from it. There's no curiosity.
And when we try to go into the transitional fossils, he say, "Oh, they are irrelevant somehow."
Yeah.
Boy, you got that right, James. There is no curiosity because they already know everything.
Yeah, I measure it directly, and I can literally measure even at the upper echelon things, the ones that are citing the primary sources. When I'm looking at Austin and Snelling and all the rest, I can observe their brains shutting off, because why are you citing a 1980s source on this subject rather than the work they did years later? You can literally perceive by what they cite and what they don't, where they're just kind of dampening down and gun cottoning their own elements. I've never found, other than Todd Wood. Todd Wood has a kind of a perverse curiosity and fairness about him. At the same time, he's got to dig his little heels in periodically to stop moving in the direction he doesn't want to go.
Yeah, one of the things I want to tell him is not to focus on just Darwin. Like, evolution has moved on since the 1800s. Like, it's the same thing with gravity and physics. Like, physicists are not only focusing on what Newton said 300 years ago or something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, it's part of their apologetic frame. This is the traditions and tropes, and it stems back to the whole religious proof texting concept, because from the proof texting religious tradition, you can say, well, thus spake Isaiah, thus spake Jeremiah, blah, that settles it permanently. So if thus spake Charles Darwin in some little quote snippet, that's true forever, that they can latch on to that as the data blip, as if no amount of information changes after that. We don't care what Darwin thinks. We have the current data. It's fun to look at what Darwin thinks because he's a very bright man, but nothing of my belief in evolution depends on whether Darwin got a little fiddly bit detail about ground sloths right in South America in 1835.
Yeah, I will say this now, even if we discovered some, like a lost letter of Darwin where he stated that I recant the theory of evolution, I don't believe it anymore. Even then, we will still accept evolution based on the data that we have now.
It's like it's like I was in a chat with our PZ was there, and he was bringing up how in the college classes he teaches, and I can say this for myself also, Charles Darwin is not brought up when talking about evolution. He is not discussed because he's not relevant.
Well, sometimes as a historical viewpoint, but not in
well,
but we don't
just as an antiquarian interest,
they don't bring it up as here's what Darwin said and here's what we now know. It's like no, we skip Darwin and go straight to the data, and so we should read what he said, I think, and because he is a brilliant person, but he's not relevant to modern conversations about evolution.
You will in physics textbook you will often see like historical figures sometimes as because they are noteworthy to remember of their discoveries and of their contributions to science.
Well, there are legitimate issues that pop up where the antiquarianism helps. The historians of science will still be fascinated by the big thrash-out debate that Wallace had with Darwin over natural selection versus sexual selection. Wallace was actually a hyper-natural selectionist. He thought that was the process, and he really dug in his heels. He didn't like the idea of sexual selection at all, whereas Darwin was saying, no, I can see that. And now we can perceive that Darwin was right and Wallace was wrong on this, that there is a sexual selection mode. And that really started kicking into high gear in the 70s and 80s. Gould started talking about it again. And so it's now a really heavy-duty issue. And the history is fun to see how far back that debate went and then why it got to the sideline. In the same way that Darwinism was in eclipse in the early 20th century, that the American evolutionists in particular were a pile of neo-Lamarckians, and we look back on them and go, oh dear, dear. And we can see why, because we have the advantage of knowing what the genetics are, and they didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know you gentlemen, but you do realize, except for Ness, but you do realize the utter futility of even considering the argument of someone who thinks evolution didn't happen. They're not much better than a flat earther.
But that's not why we have the chat with them.
Right.
The object is not to persuade Brian that he's wrong. That is not possible. The idea is to present the method, to discuss the data, to spark people's imagination. So those watching on the sideline will see us all bearing witness on this and our method and proceed accordingly.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I'm not saying that. No. Futile was the wrong word, because there is value in other people watching it. And there are lots of people, even though they don't say it or they say it very rarely, it's like, oh, well, it wasn't until I got to YouTube and actually watched these anti-evolutionists get their asses handed to them that I really started to thinking about. Or atheism or a lot of other things. Yeah, you're right. You're right. As long as you understand that you're not convincing one of these knuckleheads.
Know why you're doing it. And I have to constantly prod Jackson because I'm a source methods guy, and it's so easy to get onto the data floor and forget that source methods angle, where they're disintegrating at the base, at their core support logic. And then they're also ignorant of the data floor. And then way up in the top, the little frothy philosophy that they're trying to push, it's resting on our job to try to delineate that as much as possible.
Yeah.
I forgot it.
One of the amusing things that happened when he stumbled around the K-Nit evolution tree, like the genus Canis, they are all related, but perhaps not to foxes. And you asked, what about bears? Oh no, bears are definitely not related to dogs. But when you see a picture like this and look at their ancestors, the ancestors look a lot like each other. It's almost like they are the same. It's almost like they are the same guy.
Same situation is occurring in dinosaurs. Same thing is occurring in the reptile-mammal transition. Same thing is occurring in bird evolution out of dinosaurs. You've got crocodiles. In virtually every area where you have a pretty good fossil record, you can see that the earliest members of them are generic, and then only later are you finding them diversifying into the specialized versions that you have.
I think that the often mistake that creators make is when imagining the transition from something like fish and to a lizard is like in a single step, like very, very fast initially. But it's gradual like this. And then when you include more fossils, you get something like this.
Well, Orange is never going to actually look at the data if he's only ever going to argue about what the definition of evolution is.
Yeah, and he's going to dig his little line. He thought he's trying. It's what I call a jujitsu argument. It's the idea that you can get some little philosophical twist, some definitional frame that is the absolute slam dunk killer atomic bomb that they cannot get past, and therefore you don't have to worry about cluttering up your little brain with all those silly little taxa. No, that ain't how it works.
Yeah, and
the goal of all philosophy and all hypothesis and all theory is to explain the data. If it can't explain the data, no matter how cute and effective your argument may sound, it's air.
Right, and that's all we saw over and over and over, because all he had was the picture. You had the picture with the bacteria, the soup, the Campbell's soup.
I love that he didn't know what a monoberryman was. I'm going, yes, you ignorant git. I read more creationism than you do.
The can of soup is very telling, because he said he is just simplifying things to make it easier to understand. But I am fully convinced that he is doing this on purpose, on some level, because the can of soup, that is just an obvious attempt to ridicule evolution.
Well, as we all know, Andy Warhol made the therapsids.
I think he honestly didn't think any of the data involved.
You like that one, huh?
I think you date yourself, but I do. Me too. But I like that one. I bet the kids don't get it.
I can be accused of many things, but humorless is not one of them.
I do enjoy your sense of humor, RJ.
Well, I have a science and paleontology question for you all, because
I love those.
When I was coming up, Well, when I was really coming up, we didn't know what killed the dinosaurs, right? There's lots of speculation about it. Well, did the mammals steal their eggs? Was there some dinosaur Black Death? There was something like this. And then, of course, oh, well, we think it was an asteroid. And they looked for that asteroid for 10 years. And every couple years, you'd hear us, oh, well, we found a crater, but it's not big enough or it's not old enough and so forth and so on. And then when they found the Chicxulub crater, well, that was it. That's what did in the dinosaurs. But now...
Well, it's even more interesting than that. Yeah. Because the thing that's the big lead up is that the Deccan traps were going off in India. That the dinosaur ecosystem was undergoing a really long, and not just the dinosaurs, the critters in the sea, all of those marine reptiles, they were suffering a breakdown before the asteroid splat. This is one of the important lessons.
How long did... If you just an estimate or as close as you can, how long were these Deccan traps going off?
It's a long-term,
like a 500,000 years.
No, 10 or 20 years. This is a slow muck.
In the Middle Cretaceous, you had a fairly major extinction event, which wiped out which knocked down a number of groups of dinosaurs. And so, even before you get into the Late Cretaceous, you already had dinosaur groups starting to get knocked around.
Yeah, there are little sub-blips that are occurring all the time in these that don't quite make the big mass extinction episodes. And what's fun is when you start reading the technical literature here, and you'll find that most of the technical literature is available freebie. I know this because I don't have any money to buy stuff. So the fact that I can get them full text for free in most cases is really useful. And it's not just the Deccan traps. 3 of the 5 and possibly 4 of the 5 mass extinctions that make the top bunch are triggered by magma plumes, not asteroid impact.
Oh yeah, I find that easy to believe.
Yeah,
do you know my website? Do you know my website, Blue?
I do not. You'll have to share with us.
www.tortucan.wordpress.com. One of the postings. I'll type it in the field in here so you can get over it.
Tough Tootin'?
No. Let me type it into the side chat there so you can get the thing that way. If you don't know, that's why everybody needs to know my goddamn website. Otherwise, it's not going to do any good. That's the TIP website. There, you see that up there in the link. The module TIP 1.2 is on the mass extinctions. And I do a survey of the material on the mass extinctions and the role of everything from methane belches to the sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide spurts from these massive eruptions. You've got the Deccan traps with the India, with the KT extinction. Earlier, you have the Permian mass extinction from the even worse Siberian traps. Holy moly, that's a
killer. Those lasted a million years, and those volcanoes.
And the camp, the Central Atlantic Magnetic Province, the thing where the Atlantic Ocean was starting to open up, and in the Triassic, that's the one that triggers the Triassic mass extinction.
Right.
And they found so these magma plumes are really serious, and on smaller scale, they produce smaller scale blips. And it's the fun part to see in terms of how resilient ecosystems are to these perturbations. And the dinosaurs hung on pretty damn good, but the oceanic systems were starting to break down, and we're already in a stress mode by the time of the big asteroid. And what it means is one more thing, another bad thing that happens, we're like shit. And it's still a fascinating phenomenon about what survived and what didn't. It's so interesting that not a single dinosaur survived except for the ones that could fly. And everybody else checked out. Even tiny, small critters that you would think by mass would be just as liable, but the fact that the birds could fly and flip away to some other location and find a thing more actively and resist predators more meant that they slipped through in a way that none of the others didn't. So these are big picture issues. Does that answer your question a bit more there, Blue?
Do you have research where the early Cenozoic birds were primarily rail-like?
Yeah, and the role of oceanic dispersal. In his lucid moments, fiducia is still important as an ornithologist.
Can I check for a moment? I've recently seen a lecture from the Royal Tyrrell Museum on the causes of the extinction, also how or what determined which lineage made it out, like their diet, for example. And I will put the link in the live chat for someone.
Yeah, we're seeing really important lessons. And oh, by the way, the Royal Tyrrell, I had a chance to visit that many, many years ago. Good gravy, that's a beautiful museum. And I'm sure it's even better now. And it's a working museum because it's right next to one of the major fossil areas. It's out in the middle of nowhere. You got to drive dingle way from Edmonton to even find the damn thing. But I found the fossil displays there more impressive than the Smithsonian.
And this is from the lecture that I linked in the chat, and here you can see a diagram that says that the things that had a omnivorous diet made it out compared to the herbivore.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me because living fossils tend to be omnivores and generalists. And so the idea that something that isn't too dependent on a particularly narrow food chain, what you get is the saber-toothed cat problem on steroids, where whole ecosystems are interlocked in tightly calibrated ecological interactions, and keystone species go extinct because of the mass extinction, and everything connected to them falls apart.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, the distinction between the PD and the AD omnivore is that the AD omnivore is more like insectivore-ish.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that the mammals were extreme insectivores. In fact, the thing that was driving the formation of our lineage was the fact that they were insectivores that was expanding the dentary bone, and that was pushing pressure on things and changing the dynamics around. It eventually led to the fact that we have the ears that we do and our single dentary bone. All of that connects up to the fact that we're dealing with a niche of insectivores crawling around in the night with really good hearing to avoid being eaten by dinosaurs.
And that was the history for millions of, like 130 million years. We were just shrews.
Yeah, although to be fair, before that, the synapsids, the group of air quotes reptiles that led off to our mammals, they were the dominant group. The diapsids that produced the eventual dinosaurs and reptiles and that bunch, they were the minor players during the Permian, really minor. True. And even up until just the late Triassic, even the dinosaur clade in that proto bunch were minor players on the scene, and then suddenly they got the leg up. And what I think it had to do was their mobility, because it's probably no coincidence that these dinosaur formies have one particular feature in common. They're moving towards bipedalism and upright stance. And there's a whole mix of things.
There were also crocodile relatives that went almost the same way.
Lagosuchids.
Yeah.
Oh, also a number.
Are you having fun listening to this, Blue?
I am. I should tell you that, of course, I'm a layman, but I'm very interested in this. And I don't know if you ever saw Animal Armageddon on the Discovery Channel.
Oh, I think I did saw it.
It's all 5 of the mass extinctions plus the Toba eruption and the future extinction.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating one, because it's surprising how relatively easily the hominids went through that. There's some recent paperwork on that, but anyway, if you download
it wasn't as bad. We weren't as down as they say we were. We're down to the last.
They managed to weather through that time frame. Yeah, remarkably well. I think 70,000 years ago, wasn't the Toba around then?
74,000 years ago, and they said that we were down to at least 20,000, no more than 20,000 people. Would you say that's accurate?
I think there's been some new work on the South African hominids and that bunch, the humans in that area, that suggested that actually they were doing better, because they've looked.
See, because it was made like almost 9 years ago.
Oh yeah,
Armageddon from Discovery. There's lots of stuff that's completely wrong on it, because of course it doesn't mention the Deccan traps. The first extinction, it attributes to a gamma ray burst, which now they say did not happen.
Well,
there's still a lot of discussion on that. Although that's another one where they're looking at the climate stuff that produced this weird odd extinction that was very differential as to how far down in the ocean they were. It looked
Yeah.
like the surface dwellers are going extinct. And again, I've got a whole bunch of technical papers on that in that tip 1.2 at my website, where I
Yes.
keep that updated all the time. So all extinction related material that comes up, I funnel into that.
Yes,
And
so-
I think the most recent
What
update
is
is
your
from this
reaction?
year.
Just on a personal level, James, tell me what you think when you hear about the sixth extinction that we're going through one now that humanity has caused. Is that
We
true, or
don't know.
what does that make you
we
feel?
I'm really queasy about what could happen. We don't know whether or not we're bumping into keystone species. If you overfish, if you upset a balance, are we tipping the scales in a way that's irreversible? So anyone who knows about the evolutionary process, we've already disturbed the environment. So we're past that gate already. We live in an artificial thing where we have agriculture, we've got dams, we've got all sorts of stuff. So that's no longer a debate. But the question is, to what extent do we want to be really mindful of maintaining a lot of biodiversity? Because that's one of the storage batteries for the future. And you
Agreed.
cannot anticipate. Monocultures are the most dangerous things. That
Right.
You don't want a single fix for anything. You don't want a single defense line. You don't want any technological fixes. For example, the idea that we could make machines that could pump, that could scrub the air of carbon dioxide. Well, now you're dependent on the machines not stopping. So that you're now, instead of a natural system that is perturbation resilient in a nice, clumsy, kludgy way, which life generally is. It's probably no coincidence that these mega mass extinctions are relatively rare, that the vast majority of extinctions are low level. Eventually a species finally runs out and boom, it's gone without anything major. So yeah, I am not convinced that we're going to have some kind of mass extinction generated by human beings, but I would say that we don't know enough not to be really careful.
Okay, that's fair. That's very fair. The other thing,
anyway, I was going to say,
you can
download all the tip modules, the new material. They're all in PDF format, and there's also a tortucan.com website where I've got the little draft version HTMLs. If you can't read it on a smartphone, the PDFs are awkward on that. But anyway, try to get the PDFs if you can, if you've got a PC. And all of that material, I've assembled a bunch of stuff on that, and I try to keep that as updated as possible. There will be a description of the creationism movement and its roots and the intelligent design movement. There's stuff on that. There's material on the Darwin controversy about how anti-evolutionists have mismangled his things. There's stuff on eugenics, on epigenetics, some of the current buzzwords material. And then, of course, Jackson and I are moving into the new realm of trying to write books that are targeted to, the current apologetics. I've already hit the reptile-mammal transition in Slam Dunk, and then Jackson and I are going to do the same thing. Oh, this is going to be good if we pull this one off. No one will have ever pulled this off before, where we're just shredding the Answers in Genesis edifice all in one fell swoop.
We kind of reprised a little bit of reptile-mammal transition stuff in the first chapter, interestingly enough.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a fabulously useful one. Ironically, the little twit, Arthur Wallace, or I forgot, Walker, I think his name is. He's a young Earth creationist that defends Answers in Genesis every once in a while on Twitter. I bump into him, and he decided he's avoided the reptile-mammal transition. And what was really funny about it is that he had to trawl to try to find something on it. And the only place he could do that would be in the regular science literature, or the tiny smattering of material that he could find in the creationism venue, which wouldn't help him to discuss probiotic gnathids. There's literally nothing on it other than Krieger. And so he found a Wikipedia entry, and he quote mined a chunk of this, where they were talking about the particular circumstances that were a bunch of ensembles together, and there was volcanic ash, and he says, substitute the flood, and it sounds like they were plagiarizing Answers in Genesis. And I go, no. So I found that it was from Wikipedia, and it turns out they were referencing a wonderful paper that I didn't have in my bibliography on the taphonomy of the Ishgualasto site that points out the pyroclastic flows that were involved. And I hadn't known that before. So this was yet more indication of evidence that doesn't fit a flood. because we're talking about glass shards and stuff from airborne volcanic ash and pyroclastic flows. This is not occurring in a flood. This is not slosh. So I thanked him. Thank you, Arthur, for leading me to some new information that I will be then put into any future revised edition of Slam Dunk as yet more information on our side.
Also, didn't he also say in a video of his that we have not learned more about the fossil record or something, Jackson?
I'm sorry?
Did he not say that we haven't learned more about the fossil record since Darwin or something like that?
Brian's video, Fabulous Fossil Fails, he doesn't ever like actually discuss fossils. He says in the video at one point, this just smacked me in the face when I watched it the first time, because I had not heard of this, and I ran it by RJ, and RJ's like, no, actually, that's something I hear quite a bit. But he says,
in the bottom feeders especially.
He says, what has happened in the century since Darwin? Well, not a whole lot has changed. And I was like, what?
Say what? Say what, motherfucker? Not a whole lot.
He honestly thinks that what we know about the fossils hasn't changed in almost 200 years.
Yeah, how about it? Here is a new transitional turtle. How about that?
Oh yeah, there was a brand new paper that just popped up on this long-necked one with an edentate skull. It's a part of it, and of course, there's a few of the people. God, Miratani or Kumatani or something. He's a Japanese paleontologist. He's done a huge amount of work on that. But the reason why I like to home in on the reptile-mammal transition is because A, it's spectacular. It's blatant macroevolution, and B, the anti-evolutionist is at a disadvantage because there's so little on it on their side. And so that's why I wrote the damn book. And therefore, Jackson knows we literally know every possible counter argument. We know where they could go for evidence. We know what arguments they would have.
Forgive me. What time frame are we talking about from reptile to mammal transition?
About 400 million down to about 200 million years ago. The full-blown mammals are starting to appear on the scene at just the time the earliest dinosaurs are showing up.
Yeah. Right, but it takes 200 million years for that transition. Wow.
Well, the biggest part, by the time you start seeing the synapsids diversifying noticeably, it's about a 100-year stretch from something that's starting to look a little different. And you've seen a synapsid. Dimetrodon, the little finback that comes in the dinosaur kits, that's a synapsid. That's on our side of the reptile fence.
Right, yeah. Some of those spinebacks that got themselves warm apparently were our ancestors. And that's the thing about the animal armageddon.
Not our direct ancestors. They're not directly, but they are related to us.
But they're in the lineage. Yeah. And my favorite one is the probanognaathids and diarthrognathids. And if you don't know those, that's why I wrote the damn book, because these are killer apt. These are predicted transitional forms. Uniquely.
Was there one venomous one? Was there one that was venomous?
Not in that lineage. I don't think there's been any arguments on that one. They were basically insectivores. But the whole point is the jaw structure. It's a jaw system where Robert Broom, who later went on to do Australopithecine stuff in the 1920s, that's what he's mainly known for. But back in the earlier years, he was mainly a mammal paleontologist.
Good job, Jackson.
Bye, Jackson. Oh, too bad. Broom lived in South Africa, and so that's where a lot of these early therapsids were being discovered. In the late 1890s, they were finding these bunch, and they didn't know where mammals had come from. They suspected some form of reptilian ancestry. They knew since the 1830s that our jaw system starts out with the reptile layout with all of the bones in place and then transforms into the standard mammal layout where there's a giant dentary bone and the other bones are up in the middle ear. They've known this since the 1830s. And so how did that happen in the fossils? Well, in the 1890s in particular, after Darwin died, they started finding these funky little synapsids that have only one skull opening. That's unlike the diapsids that have two skull openings. That's the group that eventually leads off to the standard reptiles that we know and the dinosaurs and birds. That's all in the diapsids.
I see.
Die for two. And synapsids only have one. We still have that synapsid skull opening. It's our
Right.
zygomatic arch. Our cheekbone is
Yeah.
the bone structure that is in that old opening that used to be way up here on the head. If you look
Right.
at early synapsids and diapsids, they look damn similar. You really, if you look at a Dimetrodon skull and a diapsid at the same period, you got to be really careful to not realize, you know, how dissimilar the little minor fiddly bits. But as time goes on, they were noticing something really peculiar, is that these synapsids were generating a bigger and bigger and bigger dentary bone and starting to form this little flange that comes up, which eventually becomes our coronoid process that we see on all. Mammals are really boring in the jaw. You can, when you go into a museum, if you can't spot a mammal compared to a non-mammal, you are blind, because that single giant dentary bone with
Or
that
you don't know what
upwards
to
and
do
that's
for.
the zygomatic arch. It's a mammal trait. Boy, is it a mammal trait. So the fact that these synapsids were doing something that's looking more mammally said maybe that's the group that is turning into mammals, but they still had the problem of the damn jaw. How do you go from a system where an articular bone at the end of the jawbone is articulating with the quadrate up in the skull? That's where the muscles are. And that's why they could do like that. Whereas mammals use a completely different layout. It's the single dentary bone, and the muscle attachments are to the squamosal bone in the skull, not the quadrate. The articular quadrate, in fact, those little itty bitty bones are, we hear with them. They're up in our middle ear. How the hell did that shift take place? And Robert
That is
Broom
fascinating just in and of itself. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right.
Robert Broom in 1912, and by the way, he was not a Darwinist, he was not a Lamarckian, he was kind of like what we would maybe call almost a quasi Teilhard de Chardin theistic evolutionist thing, because he was very religious, and I put a little posting to a 2009 paper up in the material in my in Slam Dunk on it. I can't remember the author of the paper, Roberts or something like that. Did a neat little bio paper on Broom. But anyway, his point was there's only one way from an evolutionary point of view that this shift can take place, the jaw shift, to how you move from one jaw to another. It's that you have to have a normal format where you've got the articular quadrate functioning, and then the dentary bone has to have expanded and morphed around to form a flange that is right next to where the squamosal is, and the squamosal has to warp down to where the quadrate are so that they're all together, and a new muscle attachment forms alongside the old one so that both are functioning simultaneously. There had to be a double-jawed transitional form. No living animal has a double jaw. None. He was predicting a completely new form of life exclusively on evolutionary grounds that was a necessary transitional between the reptile and the mammal.
And they found it.
In the 1930s, when they found these double-jawed forms, they were named Diarthognathus broomii in his honor, and then they later found the Probanognathids that also had this layout. And then as they found fossils since, they can trace the formation of this double jaw, and then it's, once that dentary squamosal takes over, now the other jaw hinge can become marginalized, and it becomes increasingly marginalized because the damn mammals that were doing this, proto-mammals, were insectivores, where their dentary bone had already expanded because a long, narrow dentary arcade is good for eating bugs. It doesn't require a strong jaw. They don't need a strong jaw attachment. There's been muscle material and dynamic analysis has been done on that, and literally none of it is ever discussed by anti-evolutionists.
Of course. Of course.
And the mammal transition is really interesting because it happened over such a long period of time, and also very, very gradually also.
Yeah. That's why it's so important from the baraminology angle, is how in hell can a baraminologist, and you know what we're talking about with baraminology, right, Blue?
Please explain that word to me.
Okay, there's another term everybody needs to know.
What's
in
that term?
Baraminology, I'll type it out in the thing.
The study of what?
In short, it's the creation. In short, it's the creation.
Is Hebrew. A baramin is Hebrew for created kind. And this creationist named Marsh, back in the 1930s and 40s, decided he was going to create a scientific kindology, and he called it baraminology. That he was going to, already he had a problem because they already had so many damn animals known, he couldn't really make it work. And then a bunch of new Turks, Todd Wood, Kavanaugh, Kurt Wise, who actually has a paleontology degree, in the 1990s, they went through and decided they're going to do this. They're going to create a scientific baraminology where they're going to work out the mechanisms to how to identify what created kinds are and get a list, partly because they got to figure out what the booking plan is on Noah's Ark. So there's a bunch of imperatives why they have to do this. Now, they've been dumping into messes of problems because if we use, I brought up that term monobaramin to Brian, and he never heard of it, which means he's never read any baraminology stuff, because a monobaramin is a subset of a hypothetical baramin kind. And it's because Kurt Wise, who was trained in paleontology, borrowed all the terms from standard systematics, where there is a holobaramin, that's a holotype in systematics is the fossil representation that determines what that is systematically.
It's a creationist version of cladistics.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in a weird kind of way, because they don't actually use cladistics. They have this other. What they figure, they're parasites, because what the baraminologists do is take all the cladistic data. I don't know, Blue, do you know what we're talking about with cladism?
Yes, go on, please.
Okay, good. Cladistic analysis will have just reams of systematic data, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of character states that have all been numerized, so that they can be analyzed, and then they can do systematic analyses to test out various phylogenies to see which one is more parsimonious or not. Well, the creationists take the data and plug it into a new analysis under the supposition that a baramin will show up as distinct from another baramin if you plot them in a dimensional frame, to where there'll be a blob of characteristics here and a blob of characteristics here and no transitional in between, because they're separate kinds. Got it? So theoretically, within a baramin blob, there can be descendant lineages called monobaramins, and one of the ones that they concede is the horse sequence, where all of the things from Horacotherium down to Equus are merely a monobaramin within some not entirely specified bigger kind. So how do they deal with the reptile-mammal transition?
The parasitectiles?
Well, that's where, literally, if you read the paper that Wood and Kavanaugh and company did, and I think it was like 2001 or 2006, I allude to it several times in the various works. I've got it in those, if you download my modules, you'll find the references. Anyway, that when they did the analysis, they kept the phenacodonts as outgroups. And so what they're effectively saying is, we're going to look far back to Horacotherium and then stop looking. We're not going to compare it to Homo galax, which looks almost identical to Horacotherium. This is all buzzwords here. So if your brain is frying blue, I'll try to explain
it. Forgive me, Jay. I just got to say.
Is the other fossil more closely related to like rhinos? Yes.
Yeah. So to put it into a nutshell,
as complicated. Forgive me. I just got to ask you something. As complicated as taxonomy is, as it really is, why would I even thinking about this mountebank charlatanism that you're talking about?
Well, yeah, I would agree. And here's where it gets really fun.
But wait a minute. Do you agree with my statement that taxonomy is very difficult? I think that's a difficult subject and full of pitfalls, even if you know about evolution.
It's the roadmap to the history of life.
Right. Okay. Because
and all rigorous systematics, if you read everybody up and down the line when they make an opinion on this, the goal of systematics is to determine what the true phylogeny of life is, to find out what is actually related to what and in what relationships, and who's a cousin and how closely related they are as cousins. And that's the goal of it. Now, theoretically, creationists have the same goal. They want to find out how many kinds there are, except they are completely separately created, and within which there's a bunch of lineages, theoretically. And they are forced into that because of the needs for the Noah's Ark, because there's only a limited amount of space. If the Ark were as big as a continent, they would have no difficulty. They could put every single species on the Ark and there would be no difficulty, but they don't. They have a limited booking plan. And this was not a problem in earlier creationism because they literally didn't think about it. But these little dig in their heels baraminologists, you got to give them props. They're trying to be sciencey. They recognize they have to pin down how many kinds there are. Therefore, they need to have a tool.
You have misidentified. Forgive me. You have misidentified their goal, James. Their goal is to sell you a bridge. Okay, that's the Christian's goal.
Well, that's the apologetic evangelical side. I'm just talking about their sciencey wing. The baraminologists.
Well, that's their attempt. You got to give them props for trying to be sciencey. Well, yeah, I guess in one way that's true, but I can't easily overlook what's the motivation behind it.
Well, I don't need to worry about their motivation. I only need to look to see whether they can make their case.
I will. Then I will. You worry about the fighters. I'll worry about the tower, huh, James?
Wait a minute. I get to the motivation issues in due course, but the technical point is by focusing on their own baraminology work, I can state categorically, independent of all of their reasons why they're so concerned about doing this, they fail completely in 100% of their cases, and here's why. That's the argument that I make. Looking at it at that detail level really matters. It's revealing that only one study has been done so far by the baraminologists on the reptile-mammal transition, and it's not by the heavy guns. It's by this little twerp, Aaron. I don't even know what his first name is because he only has an initial. And he did one teeny tiny little study with one teeny tiny little subset of the Cassiids of the reptile-mammal, one family, where he flushed a third of his own data down the drain before he tried to make his judgments on it. And that's the one and only study that's been done.
That's not very honest. That's not sciencey.
Not very honest. And it's just hilarious to watch how you can literally peek into their brains to see them not looking at data. To get back to that horse sequence that Nessa guy we're talking about, you've got the fact that you've got the Horacotherium, which is a little small collie-sized critter that looks vaguely dog-like. And then you've got Homo galax, which lived around the same time and looks really, really similar. You got to be a real green eye shade a taxonomist to be able to differentiate them. It's just minor little differences between them. That Homo galax bunch leads off into the tapirs. So how are you going to keep the tapirs from connecting up through the Homo galax to Horacotherium to horses in the monobaramin by any reasonable standard? And once you've got a thing that wide, how are you going to keep the phenacodonts, which are the groups from which these Homo galax and the others go, and the parasitactyls generally? Pretty soon you've got giraffes and everything running around on the African belt is all connected up by that baraminology structure. The only way you can avoid doing that is not to look. So in these papers where they're bumping into the boundary layers of the kinds, they stop looking. And you can see them stop looking. There's something that's going on in their head where it goes, I don't want to think about that. Tortuga.
Right.
And it's fun to watch.
I have another science question.
Yeah, another science question.
Oh, before you go, I want to present this paper that somebody did. He is using Todd Wood's method of identifying kinds, and he applied it to.
Did two of those.
Yeah,
he did two papers. He did another one later on, and both of them are delightful. And I think both of them are available online, full text.
Yeah, here it says here I apply MDS, that's the method of creationist, to a phylogenetic analysis of Coelurosaurian dinosaurs, and show that it reveals morphological continuity between Archaeopteryx, other early birds, and a wide range of non-avian Coelurosaurs.
Yeah.
Creation scientists who use CMDS must therefore accept that these animals are genetically related.
This is now what's revealing about it is that only young Earth creationists do baraminology. Old Earth creationists don't do systematics at all, and intelligent designers don't do systematics at all. And why is it? Because they don't have to book Noah's Ark conceptually. Therefore, they have no imperative to do so. And so their lack of curiosity doesn't even bother trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Why were probanognathans around? Why was there Archaeopteryx? Why were there toothed whales at particular points and not in others? What the hell's going on? They don't have a map of time. And Brian is revealing his role as a bottom feeder. He's way below the baraminologists who are trying to be sciencey. No, he's scavenging off of Charles Jackson and Carl Kirby, more bottom feeders.
I have to make a warning because in 10 minutes I need to shut down this hangout because I need to go to bed soon. So
Yes,
if you have a
so thank you for coming, and I know it'll be tricky working out a time zone so we can deal with
God damn, you on time, Dutch. He's going right to bed at 11. He's cutting us off at 11.
It's almost 12 hours, but we have 10 minutes until then. So
I have a question.
Yeah, if you have one question, please ask. 10 minutes.
Oh, yeah, for both of you. What I heard many years ago is now that that Yellowstone supervolcano goes off between every 600 and every 700,000 years. And it's been 640,000 years since the last time it went off. So
yeah, quite true. I allude to that. I've got technical papers on it in that.
That one's about to pop, or it would be no surprise if that started shaking and it got ready for a real eruption tomorrow.
A lot of what we are used to is toast if it does, because the last time it erupted, it blanketed most of the United States in very heavy ash. And it would wreak havoc on a bunch of things. Life managed to get along quite nicely. There's no really major extinction events that are associated with it. I mean, the critters hunkered down and then proceeded on. But our culture, our aircraft, our need to shovel the ash off of the driveway constantly, or the fact that our cars are choking up because the catalytic converters can't.
Oh, no, that would be a worldwide civilization killer, probably.
It would be an annoyance. At the very least.
Annoyance.
I don't think it would be enough to exterminate America even. I think most people would survive this.
We figure a way around it. We're resilient.
But it would be
it would be annoying.
Yeah, it would be a very, very disaster for them, especially. Yeah. And
there's a whole bunch of other ones. I mean, there's the Madeira landslides that take place periodically in the island in the middle of the Atlantic, and when that big landslide sloshes into the ocean, it sends a 400-foot tidal wave across the Atlantic Ocean. And so everybody living on the Atlantic coast, this has happened before. The Cascadia Fault, one reason for not living in the Seattle area is that the Cascadia Fault eventually is going to go. It's going to produce disastrous tidal waves. Even if Mount Rainier just warms up, it doesn't even need to erupt. There's so much glaciers on it that there are big lahar flows previously off of there, where there are bedroom communities that are on this beautiful flat real estate that's formed from lahars from Mount Rainier. Oh, there's so many things that can happen.
The new Madrid Fault, while not due, it still could go off at any time.
That was the worst earthquake. It moved the Mississippi River.
I don't think you should be a bit worried about, because we can't really tell. It could happen many thousands of years from now until it happens.
I mean, don't stop paying your car insurance in lieu of the disasters. But the point is that we live in a bumpy world. What's fascinating and why paleoclimates, and for that matter, climatologists want to pay attention to this so much, is because it gives you measures of how resilient ecosystems are to perturbations. Some perturbations are way creepier than what we're doing with the carbon dioxide stuff, with our stuff, or various pollution things. So we can measure to see how well certain things do, how well do coral do under certain circumstances, how do the phytoplankton operate, how many things are keystone species or not. So that's why it's an ongoing and interesting study.
If I can't listen to Bach online and play fantasy basketball, I don't know, man. Okay.
Yeah,
hey,
well,
thanks for hanging out, team. We gotta go.
Go to Berg and Bartok, too.
Thanks for being here, Blue. Well.
Yeah. Well, anyway, you can go off and get some sleep. And I found it a productive evening because I learned an awful lot about what little is going on inside of Brian's brain, even though he didn't realize it, by the things that he was not curious about, by the things he didn't know about, the terms he didn't understand. I know a lot more about Brian's little gear shift than I did before.
And I think he's doing on some level on purpose, because if you have to argue in analogies all the time, then there is something not right about your way of arguing. Yeah.
He has an object of desire. presuppositional apologetics is a routinely used form in religious apologetics. It's the way they try to find a non-negotiable presupposition and force you onto that presupposition so that you lose and they win. That's the way a lot of arguments go. The Callum argument that William Lane Craig uses on cosmology, the ontological argument that's
never gets old
in general.
Never gets
this
old.
is standard. Bye. Yeah, so I like to pull everybody, and the one area that Jackson is again weakest on, simply because he knows a lot of information and he naturally goes to the data floor, and I naturally go to the data floor, and you have to consciously step back to probe the source base of your opponent when that is a point at issue. When you're talking with a normal scientist about stuff, you don't have to quiz them about which technical literature they've read. They are showing by their understanding that they already know about this, and now you can thrash out the data and not worry about that. But when you're dealing with a creationist, you have to explore that presuppositional source data structure, where when you find out who he reads, that he literally can't tell the difference between a quote mine and reading the original material. His brain isn't perceiving a difference.
He said, I have a list of quote mines, as if it is something to be proud of.
Yeah, and for him it's okay, because a character string is presuppositionally useful because it's the character string. And the idea that the context is relevant, and he needed to check the context and read what happened since, to where we don't care what that character string said in 1880, it's 2018. That kind of connectivity, that sort of curiosity, that move beyond bit, that isn't happening in his head. Nothing is happening. And that accounts for why he can do what he's doing. He's not being dishonest. He's following in that framework where things that are light bulbs that go off in everybody else's heads aren't going off in his head.
No. I don't think for the most part he is not being dishonest, but I think on some level he is, like the soup can, but like something like that needs to be
that's
something that's on.
And there everybody likes to pick up the same way that everybody can be drawn to these sorts of things. When I can't forgotten his name. He's written a little book, but Pro-Evolution, he used the Corvette as an analogy, and that's turned out because that's a designed object, and even though it was carefully framed as only an analogy, everybody kind of riffed off of it and went a different direction, and there were a lot of complaints about it. So these things happen in a lot of different frameworks. I'm trying to get more and more people onto that source methods approach, because it has a level of objectivity and a need, a bypassing from ad hominems and the need to say whether somebody is a liar or not. No, we don't have to worry about that. We can objectively observe what sources they use. We can objectively observe what sources they don't. We can objectively ascertain what information they know, to what extent they work out their model of what they think happened, or in his case, he doesn't. And the people that he draws on don't do that either. And all of those are objective source issues.
Yeah, all right. Now I need to close the Hangout, unfortunately, but it was a very good talk. Thank you, Archie.
I wish you could have gotten in more, but it was Jackson's show, and I'll plead guilty to the fact that because Jackson and I are collaborators, he cuts me slack to interrupt in a way that gives me a shoot his mouth off thing. I did try to mute myself as much as possible. There were just some areas where, holy moly, get off the damn dogs.
I was trying to shut up also, and you saw me writing things in the group chat desperately to get it through, but still.
And another purely trivial tactical detail, because you have an accent, that it makes it harder to be able to hear for some people, and that complicates the matter. It doesn't mean your information is inaccurate or anything. It just is that's another hurdle to get past. But I hope you can be involved enough if Brian gets a thing on. And of course, you're certainly welcome, although the time zone is so crappy for you. But you're certainly welcome to pop in anytime to my evolution hour.
Thank you.
Because you'll be welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, my strength lies more in written discussions than live discussions.
Well, there's a utility to it. I'm in a weird position of somebody who doesn't watch many videos because I think they are a time waster doing video series. But the point is that that's part of the way people find out about things. what I'm trying to do in that, and that's why Jackson and I and others who put up the linkages to the technical papers in what we are bringing up, we are consciously trying to nudge people as training wheels onto the actual area of inquiry, which shouldn't be videos.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I will end then out. Thank you,
Go
RJ.
to sleep.
Thank you, RJ. And as Jackson says it, see you all next time.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.